In this project we're going to create a toy camera effect, all inside of Adobe Camera Raw. I've started this project by setting the Camera Raw defaults, so we have no adjustments applied to this image at present. And then I'm going to go to the Lens Corrections panel. In the Profile tab, I'm going to click on the Enable Lens Profile Corrections. And then in the Color tab, I'm going to choose Remove Chromatic Aberration, as this is a wide-angle lens that has been used to capture this image. And then I'm going to click on the Manual tab. I'm going to move over and click on the Upright. We've got a slightly crooked image here, so I'm just going to see whether the Upright feature will straighten this. So I'll click on the A. Okay, there's a small rotation there, but I just want to check that horizon line is absolutely straight. So I'm going to click on the Show Grid at the bottom of the panel here. I'm going to enlarge that grid so we can see more clearly how that horizon line lines up with the grid here. It's still slightly crooked, and that's probably because some of these verticals are not absolutely straight. Okay, so I'm going to click on the Rotate slider here and then just move that slightly to the right until that horizon line lines up with the grid. Maybe a 0.4 or 0.5 degree rotation should do the trick. Okay, now we've got a little bit of transparency creeping into the corners here. I could either choose to crop this image or I could just scale this image. Here, if I just scale it up by perhaps even just 1%, that should be sufficient to remove the transparency in the corners there. I'm now going to deselect the Show Grid option there. Okay, and let's return to the basic panel. Okay, I'm now going to set about making some color and tone adjustments. Now I'm not necessarily looking for accuracy here, because in the toy camera effect we're going to be emulating a processed film which isn't true to real life colors. Okay, so the first step I'm going to make is to make this image a lot warmer. So I'm going to move the temperature slider up to around about 7,500 degrees Kelvin. Okay, this is actually closer to a daylight setting from the white balance if you wanted to try clicking on that as an alternative approach. Okay, and now I'm going to make some adjustments to some of the sliders. We'll start with the contrast slider to give this image a little bit more punch and raising that to around about +60. I'm also going to do the same thing with the shadows, because some of these shadows are now becoming very dark inside of the image. So I'm going to raise that to +60 as well. And you can see that brings a lot more detail back into the shelter in the middle of the image there. I'm also going to give the image a little bit more clarity, perhaps even quite a lot. We'll take that up to 60, and I'm also going to raise the vibrance to a same amount, perhaps 60 as well. Okay, so there we go, just a recap. We've got 4 sliders all there raised to +60 to give this image a lot more drama. Okay, we're now going to create a cross-process look inside of Adobe Camera Raw, and we could do this in a number of ways, such as the split toning feature, but I'm going to create the look of a slightly faded film by using the curves feature. Okay, so I'm going to click on the tone curve icon in the panels there, and we can come into the RGB, but with later versions of Adobe Camera Raw we also have access to the red, green and blue channels. I think I'll start the process with the blue channel. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the shadows a lot thinner and give it a color cast. Now I can just click on this shadow point and drag it up the wall to a position of an output value of around about 40. Alternatively, I can just press the plus key, which selects that point, and then in the output field just enter in a value of 40. And as you can see, we've now got quite a strong blue cast, predominantly in the shadows of the image. If I press the plus key again, that automatically sets the white point on the curve, and I can now lower that value to a value of 215. Okay, so we're about 40 down and 40 up on both of those points there. And this makes the white point inside of the image quite yellow, as if it's on a faded paper print. I'm going to put some more warmth back into the image by using the red channel. And we're just going to put in a contrast S curve, not a very steep one, just perhaps 10 levels up on the highlights there, and maybe 10 levels down on the shadows. Okay, so we've got about approximately a 10 adjustment on both of those there in order to create that warmer image. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to one of the new filters inside of Photoshop CC, which is the Radial Filter. Okay, and I'm just going to zero all of these sliders and set a negative half a stop exposure by clicking on the minus value next to the exposure slider there, and that will zero all of the other sliders. But I also want to add in some a defocusing effect on the edges of the image to emulate a poorer quality lens that has been capturing this image. So I'm going to wind that all of the way down to minus 100 sharpness there. Now if we look at the little radio button effect, either outside or inside, I definitely want to be adjusting the outside of this ellipse that I'm going to be drawing here. Okay, so I'm going to click in the middle of this shelter here and then drag out, and so I cover the entire shelter here. Now we can click on the pin and reposition that if required, and we can also click on the bounding box handles and readjust the size of this radial gradient here. And as you can see, at the edges of the image we're defocusing the image nicely, but we're also darkening the image off. We could just see a before and after by clicking on the preview there to see the effects of this radial gradient. Okay, we're going to move our attention now to the graduated filter. And again I'm going to choose a minus half stop adjustment. All of the other sliders have again been zeroed by clicking on that minus figure. But this time we're going to take the shadows and we're going to raise the shadows. Perhaps I'll try to a 100% value this time. What I'm looking to do is to darken the sky, but not darken the shadow values of this shelter here. So we're going to click just above the top of the shelter and drag down, and as you can see, as I drag that filter over, the top of the shelter is actually getting a little bit lighter, which actually I quite like. If that is a bit excessive, I could just back off to perhaps a plus 80 value. Holding down the shift key will constrain that graduated filter to a perfect vertical. I'm going to add a second graduated filter up from the bottom of the image now. Again, holding down the shift key and moving that up. Again, I'll hold on to that plus 100 shadows because we've got a little bit of shadows at the bottom of this shelter. But I don't feel the graduated filter is quite dark enough in this instance. So I'm just going to drag that exposure slider just down a little bit more so we get a little bit more darkening at the base of the image. Okay, now I'm finished with the graduated and radial filters. I'm going to move my attention to the effects panel. So we'll just click on the zoom tool or the hand tool to come out of that tool, and we're going to move along now to the FX icon, which is the effects panel. And I'm going to emulate film grain here, and probably the best way to do that is to zoom in to 100%. So we can actually see what the film grain is going to look like. I'm just going to hold down the space bar and then drag that to an area of smooth tone, the sky, and also some of the bus shelter here. Okay, so we're going to raise the grain slider to a value of around about 30, just to get some nice film grain effect going on there. We can be more aggressive with this, but I think that's sufficient in this particular project. And then I'll just right click and select fit in view again. Okay, now that we've added our grain, I want to add a paper border, or to something that simulates a paper border to the edge of this digital image anyway. And we're going to do that using a post-crop vignette here. I'm going to select the style as color priority rather than highlight priority, or the second one on the list there. And I'm going to drag the amount slider all of the way over to the right hand side. Okay, now we'll take the midpoint slider and drag that all of the way to the left, and finally drag the round slider all of the way to the left as well, and that pushes the vignette out to just the borders. And we also have that faded yellow appearance on the edge of that border as well. Now if this is a particular style that you like and you'd like to apply it to other images in your collection, then it's probably worth setting this as a preset, so we don't have to do quite so many steps on previous attempts. So I'm just going to come over to the presets panel, and we're going to click on the new preset icon here. Okay, this will open up the new preset. Now you have to examine all of these very carefully. At the moment it's applying all of the settings here, but sometimes we don't want to apply all of the settings because all of the raw images might start with slightly different parameters. For instance, the white balance might be just specific to this one image, so I might decide to uncheck the white balance. Likewise with exposure, some of the images we're starting with might be slightly underexposed or overexposed, and so the exposure to any particular image might be specific to that image alone, and the exposure isn't actually contributing anything to this particular style, so I'm going to uncheck the exposure as well. Now there's a lot of these settings that we haven't used. For instance, like we haven't used the split toning. Now we could leave that in place, which would zero any split toning already applied to an additional image, or we could just take that away now. Okay, I'm reasonably happy with those settings. I'm going to create a toy camera effect on the next image I apply, so I'm just going to give this a name that I'll remember the look or style of this image. Okay, and then select OK. Now just to show you how quickly we can apply this preset, what I'll decide to do is go back to the camera raw defaults, which is the start position, and if I was coming and this was a new image and I was coming in and I wanted to look what the toy camera effect would look like on this particular image, I would again just come to the presets panel and just click on toy camera. And there you go, we have it set. Now remember, I didn't adjust the white balance or exposure for this image, so these would have to be set manually in the basic panel. And as we decided previously, we decided on a color value of 7,500 degrees approximately, and then we could make some minor adjustments to the exposure slider to get the optimum exposure for this particular image. You may also notice that the radial filter and the graduated filter haven't been applied when we added the preset. And that's because the presets don't contain localized adjustments, so these are two additional things that you will have to add if you're trying to create a particular style or look. Okay, and that concludes the tutorial.